On, and we are live.
Hi, welcome to the Wellbeing Show. I'm your host, Noel McDermott. I've got a great guest on tonight, Natasha Devon. I like the fact that we do these shows now and sort of on these electronic media, because handily people put their names underneath their faces, and I know who I am because I've written my name in there. You can't see James, he's our technician in the background. It's a pity, we were just talking about to James just before we came on that when we were live in the studio, you'd actually see him. In fact, what James did, because he's a little bit of a narcissist, is he set up the camera so it shone on him mostly. And even though it was my show and it was like it showed him just sort of the side of my face, not even the nice side of my face. So there you go. You get the full frontal experience of me now, which I'm not sure whether that's a pleasant experience or not, but there you go. Welcome to the Wellbeing Show. We are live in the UK. It's the 29th of July. And we have Natasha with us. Welcome, Natasha. Natasha's a writer, researcher, mental health activist, and joining us from her home in what used to be Middlesex, but no longer exists anymore. So I think the Russians came and stole it or something like that. And it no longer exists. So it was done away with. But luckily you weren't done away with. Natasha, you're still with us, which is great. Welcome to the show. Really good to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
How are you doing? How are you doing?
I'm all right, thank you. I've just come back from, my mum had an operation last week. Oh. And so I went to my parents for a week to provide cooking and cuddles and entertainment and all of that. So I've just come back to Middlesex and sort of readjusting to London life.
Is that part of your professional life? You're a professional cooking cuddler?
No, only my mum.
People hire you for it?
No, not for, definitely not for hire.
I think during this particular period of time, that would be actually quite a niche and quite a sought after sort of market, a cooking cuddler. Somebody who came and did some nice food and gave you a hug while they were doing it.
It's something to fall back on, isn't it? It all goes belly up.
Absolutely. And how has it been during the whole sort of lockdown and then coming out of it? How have you been during that time?
It's been, on the whole, I would say quite a positive thing, insofar as I was so busy before lockdown. I was going into an average of about 3, sometimes 4 schools every week. I was traveling all over the country, sometimes further afield, going abroad. And when you're self-employed, I think you get into this habit of, if you're offered work, you take it because you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I got into that habit and I didn't really have a work-life balance. And there were so many things that I wanted to pursue that were on the back burner. So lockdown has been an opportunity to do that. I mean, I did freak out when we were first in lockdown. I did completely freak out, but now I've found bit of a rhythm, and I'm actually, on the whole, from a personal perspective, you understand, quite glad it happened. Obviously I'm not glad it happened for humanity, but it's been a good thing for me.
So has it done that thing for you that it's done for quite a lot of people, that it's just sort of got you to reevaluate your priorities and what's important to you, and set a new set of goals?
I think that's right. It's made me realize that if I'm not being super productive every minute of the day, the world will not end. I have a lot of nervous energy, and I'm used to channeling that into a project constantly.
Yeah.
And I sort of knew that wasn't necessarily the best coping strategy, but I always thought I'll deal with that maybe when I retire. There will come a time when I need to deal with that, but it's come earlier than I expected, and I've actually got to a stage now where I can chill out, and that's not a skill I had before.
Well done. I mean, it is quite a challenge. I mean, I think it's true when people are freelance, that the drive is on, isn't it? That you say yes. It's very difficult to sort of learn to say no. But I guess this experience, this event that we're all going through, has been a big no to all of us, and something that's well beyond our sort of control. And we were just talking about that just before we came on air, about I guess all of us had to learn to sort of, what is the boundaries of what we control, at the moment, and not a lot is the answer. We don't have much control over many things. So you're an activist, a mental health activist. Tell us what that means. I should have mentioned Natasha's also been recognised for all of this thing. You have an MBE as well, don't you?
I do, and actually I can tell you this is an exclusive. In tomorrow's papers, I've signed an open letter to ask for the names of the honours to be changed, because whilst it was lovely to be recognised and to, you know, go and get a badge from the Queen and get dressed up and go to the palace and all the rest of it, I am not comfortable having member of the British Empire after my name, knowing what the British Empire did historically. So a number of us who have received honours are asking for it to be changed.
Right.
I don't know if I'm allowed to say to what, but yes, I did. I am recognised as an activist, but I like saying activist more than campaigner, just because I like to think that what I'm doing is pushing for structural change. And when I hear campaigner, I think of someone who's raising awareness, which is super important. It's visibility and representation, particularly in mental health, is very important, but it only takes you so far. So one of my current campaigns is about changing the law, and I'm trying to look at root causes. You know, things like sexism, racism, homophobia, inequality. All of these things have a direct impact on our mental health, and it really needs to go to the roots of our culture. You know,
they make us ill. Those things.
Yeah.
If we're subject to those types of things, we will become psychologically distressed by them, or mentally ill, whichever term you prefer, without a doubt. It's absolutely. Poverty is one I would add into that as well. That creates huge sort of psychological distress for people, and all things, of course, that we can do something about. I think really important. And I think maybe picking up on your point about sort of which term do you prefer, mental illness or psychological distress?
Well, I tend to use mental illness.
Okay.
But I do quite like psychological distress. I might nick it. I do. Yeah, I do quite like it, because it's not inherently long term, is it? Psychological distress. It's something that you can manage.
Yeah, I mean, I got the term from a colleague of mine who has bipolar. He's also a very successful, very good psychologist who treats people with various conditions, and he prefers that. As I identify as somebody who's had long-term mental illness, and I choose the term mental illness. I'm old enough to sort of say things like, I like to call a spade, and all of that sort of nonsense. But I think it's really important that people find words that they're comfortable with. And I also think it's really important that the lexicon, the terminology around becomes more complex and less easy to pin down. And much more intersectional, as you've just mentioned, that we understand that psychological distress, mental illness are largely social events, social, political, economic events, and therefore can be dealt with. I think the old model of mental illness as a biological phenomenon that somehow we inherited by luck of the draw, sorry, but there you go, is gradually, even now, I mean, in some places it's still really believed, but gradually people are understanding that it's a fallacy, it's not real, it's not true. It's much more complex than that.
I've been having lots of conversations actually with people who work in the field who they get very frustrated when people say to them, don't make it political, because it is. And, you know, just to give you one example, there's a phenomenon, I'm sure you know about this, whereby Black men are more vulnerable to serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia. So there's a less of an instance of what you might call mild to moderate mental illnesses like anxiety and moderate depression, but far more likely to present at the acute end of the scale. And when you ask commentators about that, they very often say it's a cultural thing, it's a cultural thing. But then when you look a bit closer, you see that Black men are far more likely to be referred to services through, for example, the police. And so there's a fear, we live in a country where a Black man got locked out of his own house and was arrested for trying to get back into his own house. And obviously there's going to be a fear around engaging with any kind of authority figure there. So no wonder they're not reporting those symptoms of mental illness when they're more mild to moderate. Now that is 100% a political issue. And if you're going to address it, you have to get political, unfortunately.
I think access is one thing, but also I think with things like psychotic illnesses, which actually it's a gender issue as well. Men in general are more likely to be labelled in that way. But I think in partly it's about trauma as well, and the role of trauma within the development of those types of mental illnesses as they present and historically. And guys in general, particularly Black men, will be labelled in a particular way and have responses which are around physical violence. And that has results and consequences in terms of avoidance of services, but also what happens, and certainly with the police involved. And I'm not going to have a go at the police and the handling of mental health in the UK, because I think on the whole the police deal with mental health in the UK very well, and they understand their powers, and they're not going around. But certainly an aggressive man, an aggressive Black man, they won't assume that's a representation of a mental illness. They will assume it's a representation of a behavioural trait requiring an intervention, which is control and restraint. And actually, as you know, and as I know, as people are involved in the field, that if you're having a psychotic episode, you're likely to appear quite disturbed and quite frightening in your behaviour. And it does take a bit of sensitivity to see through that and understand it.
It's the perception of what is aggressive as well. I don't know if you saw that BBC drama called Sitting in Limbo, which was about Anthony Bryan, who was one of the people who was wrongly deported during the Windrush scandal. And this guy's life was completely torn apart. And his wife, who is a Black woman, is talking to the officials who are dealing with it. And she's in a lot of distress and she's being very firm, but they're saying to her, there's no need to shout. And I just, when you listen to what Black people say about the number of times when they're told they're being aggressive or shouting or they're angry, when it's nothing of the sort, it's just a natural response to what's happening. I imagine that with all men, there's a perception problem there as well, when they're trying to communicate distress, but it's being interpreted as dangerous or angry or violent.
And I think there's also stuff, and again, there are shadings of this, but there's stuff about EQ, the development of EQ and the ability to communicate certain types of ways, which are valued more in one gender and valued less in another gender. It's not because there's some sort of genetic inability; it's just very much a sort of the way you're brought up. And also, I think my experience of working with guys and men who are more marginalised as well is that being vulnerable isn't necessarily the first thing you think of when the forces of the state come at you. And sitting down and gently explaining your experience to people isn't necessarily the first thing that's going to come to your mind if you see uniformed police officers come.
Of course.
You know what I mean?
I do.
I don't know what people are suggesting is going to happen in a situation like that. Obviously, it has to be the training of the professionals have to really take this on board and look at, how they work with de-escalation procedures and also how we train these professionals to understand that most of the presentations they're seeing is somebody who's disturbed. And they just have to understand that and work with it. My experience, though, I have to say, when I've, worked with the police on Mental Health Act things, that obviously that's the bit of the police that are interested in that work, and they tend to be quite sensitive. But I think it's again coming back to your point about the need for structural changes. There's some great individuals that exist, and lots of really nice people and good people that exist, but the system somehow stops that from being the main representation, that genuine heartfelt stuff that people might have. Somehow the system stops that from happening. And it's, why does that happen? That's the question we have to ask ourselves, I think. And how do we change that structurally? Because even with the best will in the world, an individual can do very little in the face of, if there are certain types of policies and procedures that are in place. And, on a simple level, for example, the UK police approach to dealing with what they perceive as an aggressive or potentially violent person is to swamp them. And that's a tactic they have, which isn't a negotiation. They don't negotiate in that situation, that they swamp and they... and that's the opposite of what you want to do with somebody who's having psychological distress, who's not in a fit state to be able to sort of manage themselves anyway. That, if you swamp them in that way, you're just going to trigger a larger response. You're not going to trigger a rational response, which is, I think, what that idea is, that somehow outside observers then go, oh, well, didn't you just realise that? Can't they see that they can't win? No, not when you're having a psychotic episode. There's not a lot you can see at times like that, to be honest. And if you're so terrified that you've lost your mind, I don't know how people expect somebody to then, faced with force, to recover their mind somehow. It doesn't seem to make sense to me. So
it's interesting that you say that, because I run a campaign called the Mental Health Media Charter, and one of the things that we're talking about within our community at the moment is the way that Kanye West is being represented in the press, and he has a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and from my perspective, I would say he's clearly not well, and he's saying a lot of things which people are finding divisive or funny. He's become this kind of memeable character on the internet, this laudable character, and I don't know whether that would happen with any other illness. Certainly not if he had a physical illness. Would people be ridiculing him to this extent? And it's this understanding. I mean, Matt Haig said it beautifully a few days ago on Instagram when he said, it's not pretty, mental illness, and sometimes people do behave in ways that are hurtful, and they do lash out and they say things that they don't mean or that make no sense. And we have to challenge this narrative that vulnerability always means this fragile person that you can scoop up and make better,
like somebody with the nice Down syndrome person comes up and hugs you inappropriately, and that's the view that people have. Of course, it's nothing like that. And particularly bipolar, the reality is that people with serious bipolar will appear quite odd to the rest of us, and that's just the way it is. And I often, I work a lot with families where mental illness is presented for many years, and it's a challenge if one of your parents has bipolar. Even with great medication and great compliance with that and all that sort of stuff, and really good management of the illness, it's still, the person is going to present in quite odd ways. And that needs to be understood and talked about, as you say, in an insightful manner, rather than that, it's something to be amused about. It's not, definitely not. And I think you're right. And the same thing happened with Sinead O'Connor, I think, when she went through her significant breakdown, and she was doing things in public which, if you look back on them, if that happened to me, if I'm looking back on it from a position of saying I've become stable from a very florid, very vulnerable episode in my life when my illness took over, and then I look back on it, and that's there out in the public eye, it would be incredibly hurtful. I think I'd find in the times when I have been quite ill with my sort of stuff, I've lucky that I'm not important. So nobody's been around sort of recording me or thinking it's worth noting. It's been, relatively private, and the people who've seen it are friends and family and colleagues who I'm lucky with, are very compassionate and understanding and insightful, and have offered me support. But I think if you're in the public eye, it's really disturbing how...
Well, it's also more difficult, I think, to take that label off of yourself. I know that this is a really imperfect analogy, but if you break your leg, people accept that it can heal. If you have diabetes, people accept that you can manage it.
Yeah.
With mental illness, there's always, I think, a little bit of, are they fit for their job, or can we trust them, or should they be in a relationship? That people don't see in the same way that you can live alongside mental illness happily and successfully, and it's just learning the combination of things that allows you to manage it successfully, and that can take time, and you can have peaks and troughs. Yeah. But I think that's why, I work with young people, and in particular parents are terrified of their children being given that label, because they know that that's going to follow them for the rest of their life.
I mean, generally, I think we are quite cautious about diagnosing children anyway. Anybody under 18 were thoughtful, should be thoughtful about diagnosing, because a lot of things can happen when your brain is changing so much because of hormones that after they settle down don't make sense anymore, or don't appear anymore. It's interesting when I think that there is this thing of, that I guess that's why I'm very cautious of the notion of mental illness being seen somehow like a biological illness, that it's treatable, you get over it, and that's it. Now, I think for the more common forms of mental illness, anxiety and depression, straightforward anxiety and depression, I want to say this to anybody who's listening: get that early, get treatment for it at first presentation, and the evidence is it won't ever come back to that extent. We will always, throughout our lives, have periods of depression or anxiety because of life circumstances, and that's a sort of normal reaction to the situation that we find ourselves in. So a lot of people at the moment are experiencing anxiety and depression as a reaction to the pandemic and what it's done, and that's okay, and people can manage that. And those types of responses, they're not illnesses anyway, but they are disturbing, and that's where I prefer the term psychological distress. That it's normal to have psychological distress if the world's going through a pandemic. Yeah. That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Like, you might be a little bit frightened and anxious about that, and you might be a bit worried and depressed about your possible future. It seems a rational response to me, and I'm not going to label that as an illness. But again, even if you're experiencing that, we know a lot now about how we can help ameliorate that and reduce the sort of the uncomfortable sort of distressing bits of it. But certainly, if people present with a first acute presentation of anxiety or depression, I want to say to you now, if you're listening, go get help for it straight away. Don't wait till it becomes chronic or has hung around forever. Don't wait till you think it's serious enough to get help. That's when it becomes a real problem. Get help now, and there's lots of help for people. But the sort of mental illness that you and I are talking about is the stuff that isn't easily just disposed of, because it's very much because it's a response often to circumstances that have gone on for a long time. We just talked about some of those circumstances, and it's had quite a profound impact on the individual. We are talking more about sort of management of those things and management of life as well, so that your life becomes... you sound to me as somebody who's got some personal experience of this, not as somebody who just an outside observer sort of interest. Well, that's interesting. Are you okay to talk about that personal experience, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. So I, looking back with the knowledge that I have now,
right.
I realize I've experienced panic attacks since I was 10.
Wow.
But I didn't know that they were panic attacks at the time, because nobody had ever talked to me about what a panic attack was. Nobody knew what they were or understood it.
So what is a panic attack? You help
well,
me.
in my experience, they present differently in different people, but in my experience, it's suddenly the world is just too much. Colors are too bright, sounds are too loud. I become very myopic. I kind of fix on one spot, and I start to feel very hot, and then I hyperventilate. I have what feels like
breathe too fast or something.
Yeah. And I have what feels like a lump in my throat,
Right.
which isn't a lump. So, because my doctor actually looked for a lump when I said that was what I could feel, but it's actually my throat muscles constricting, because this is where I hold my tension.
Wow.
So, and I call the lump.
Natasha.
It is. Now I know what it is. It's less frightening. I think knowledge is definitely power. But I call the lump Nigel as well. I gave him a nickname, which also makes him less frightening. So that's how it presents.
Somebody you knew or something? I'm just intrigued.
Oh, it's named after Farage, because just when you think it's gone away for good.
That's fantastic.
Yeah,
absolutely fantastic. that takes the power out of it. Well done.
Yeah, it does.
Fantastic.
But I think because for me it was so much to do with breathing, and my breath became quite sort of wheezy. Initially, my doctor thought I had asthma, so I was given an inhaler. And when that didn't work, they said it must be allergies. It just all through my sort of childhood and teenage years, it kept being misdiagnosed, because people didn't talk about mental health in the same way back then as they do now.
Right.
So that's
it's also interesting. I don't know if
you
know this. It's interesting that if a woman presents to a doctor with psychological distress, she's more likely to get a medical diagnosis and a tablet and a medication. Even in the UK today, much less likely to be prescribed a psychological therapy.
That's
really
interesting.
Odd, even though we were alluding to differences between genders in presentation around mental illness, even though women are more likely to present around what we call the common mental illnesses, such as anxiety and depression, which are the ones that are most amenable to psychological therapies. It's something bizarre that goes on. So your story is one I've heard a lot, actually.
That's really interesting, because we, again, at the Mental Health Media Charter, we did a campaign around International Women's Day, trying to understand where the experience of being a woman and the experience of having mental health difficulties kind of intersect. And the thing that we heard over and over again was women being told that they were hysterical, or that they were drama queens, that they were exaggerating in some way. So that might sort of play a part, I guess, in that response.
All part of it. I mean, it's just really interesting that, women will do experience the common mental illnesses much more than men, and yet won't get the appropriate treatment. Are given medication, are given biological treatments, and that are not shown to work as effectively as sort of psychological therapies approaches, but in particular CBT, which is a very, very well evidenced sort of psychological therapy that works with these things. So I've heard also that some people, and this didn't happen to you, but some people experience panic attacks as though, and they get similar symptoms to sort of a heart attack, don't they? They have a numb arm, for example, or did you get a tight chest, tightening around your heart and things like that as well?
That's not something that I get, but I do know people who experience that kind of tight chest, and also palpitations, their heart beating really quickly. And it manifests differently in different people. And I know people who, they are having a panic attack, their brain is doing somersaults, but from the outside they actually appear quite calm, and it's not obvious to anyone else. With me, it's very obvious. If I'm having a panic attack, you can see it from the outside. But I think that one of the things that I recommend people do if they are experiencing panic attacks is to try and plot it from 1 to 10. So it's like you were saying with anxiety and depression, if you catch it early, I find it's much easier to bring yourself back to a point where you're calm. And so if you know what those early warning signs are, and for me, it's feeling irritable. when I'm just angry at the world, I know I'm having an anxious day,
Yeah.
and that I have to take extra care of myself that day. And I use that technique. I used to have, at my worst, I was having 2 panic attacks a day.
Oh wow, Natasha, that's awful.
Which
Poor
was
thing.
completely debilitating.
Yeah.
But now I have about 2 a year,
Right.
and it's all for me been about catching them in those early stages.
And what works for you in terms of managing them when you can feel it in that early? What do you do that knocks it on the head?
There's a couple of techniques that I use for the physical elements. My therapist taught me to think of anxiety like a wave, and to lean into it and then lean out. So I tense every muscle in my body for a count of 5, a slow count of 5, and then release for a slow count of 7.
Wow.
And I repeat that until the release becomes easier than the tense, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I also found that writing everything that is worrying me down. So I get what I call the washing machine thoughts that go round and round and round.
Yeah.
And some of them are things I'm genuinely worried about that day. And some are things that are from the past. And some are things I have no control over. And one of the things I need to do is separate them out and try and focus on the things that I can control.
Yeah. Yeah. Great advice. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And of course, panic is part of the more broader term of anxiety disorder. So, but panic disorders are a specific thing within that. And do you sort of experience anxiety more generally? Is that a sort of...
So I have what my therapist calls obsessive compulsive drive.
Okay.
Insofar as it's like I was saying to you before, I'm somebody who always needs to be moving forward. And even at school, I was kind of classic perfectionist, the kind of person who it had to be an A star, and A wasn't good enough.
Yeah.
And trying to put that nervous energy into something, which is actually, it's really effective until you have nothing to do. And then it kind of turns inward. So it's learning to just be with yourself.
Yeah.
And not overanalyze it, everything that is, for me, it's something that I'm still coming to grips with.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, we were telling in the research chat, you had issues around food as well for a while.
Yeah.
Didn't you? I mean, you went into the modeling world as a commercial model for a while, and which in itself is, you know, the as we know, the fashion industry and modeling is almost designed to produce disordered eating in people because of it's an extreme version of body perfect or whatever is being sold for that particular season. But was it as a result of going into the industry, or did you know what was going on for you?
I think it would be oversimplistic to say that it was as a result of going into the industry, but I do think that if you are anxious, your body is one of the easiest things to channel that energy into, because it's literally the closest thing to you, and because you can see the changes that you're making, it's tangible.
Yeah.
And I do remember one of the first castings, which is like an audition for a model, one of the first castings that I ever went to, the casting director said, "You've got an amazing face, but your body's letting you down." And it kind of lodged there in my brain, and it became almost like a mantra of, if I can just be this size, everything will be better. So it's not as simple as vanity or an obsession with my body. There were so many things in my life that I was dissatisfied with at that time. And I carried around this belief that if I could just make my body look right, then everything else would fall into place.
Right. And we've been talking about some of the sort of social, political and cultural pressures on people and how they lead to the development of sort of mental illness. And it's well known, for example, that the messages that we're pumping out to girls and young women and women in society can put pressure on to want to look in a certain way.
Mm.
Were you aware of those types of pressures? Is that something that you were aware of growing up with?
I think I was. So I should say my mum was a model and then a fashion buyer. And I very much felt that she was doing that thing and I needed a different identity. And I grew up in Essex as well, which is a very image conscious part of the world. And I rebelled against that hard when I was a teenager. So my mum will tell you stories about, you know, her going, she always says we're a bit like Edina and Safi from Absolutely Fabulous, where she's going to be, will you just put some lip gloss on and go out and snob boys and get drunk and be normal? And I'm like, no, mother, I'm reading 1984 for the 8th time. You know, it was very much, yeah, I'm clever and I'm academic, that's my thing. And it was only really when I went into modeling, which was not something that was ever on my agenda, it's not something I wanted to do, I got scouted, that became a part of my life. So I don't think obviously I understood that we lived in a world that does put a lot of pressure on women, but I wouldn't say that I was that aware of it up until I was about 17.
Okay. And you don't think that then contributed to sort of the development of the dysmorphia on your part?
Definitely it did.
Okay.
I had bulimia, and I now understand, of course, that, you know, when you purge, when you find ways to rid yourself of the calories that you've consumed, your body goes into starvation mode, and so it becomes this vicious circle, because your body's calling out for more food because it's not getting the nutrients that it needs, and so you end up in this binge purge cycle. But for me, it was I think I do think that I developed a kind of addiction to food by the end, but it definitely began, it was all about a desire to try and control what I looked like.
And let's just tell people about bulimia. Some will understand and some won't. I mean, I think, you know, from the Carpenters onwards, we've thought of eating disorders as those people who restrict food and then lose body weight and they look skeletal. And to those of us that don't have the disorder, they look ill. But to the person that has the disorder, they don't. They think they look great. And, well, they don't think they look great. Very rarely do they think they look great, to be honest. That was a silly thing for me to say. But they don't see themselves in the way that we're viewing them. So they would see themselves as having a lot more fat than they do have. But that wasn't your case. You didn't restrict and starve yourself in that with bulimia. How does bulimia manifest?
So the key part of bulimia is it actually comes from bulimia. The literal translation is the appetite of an ox. So what characterizes it is eating far, far more than you need, going on these binges, and then finding a way to rid yourself of the calories. So that can be, in my instance, it was mostly making myself sick, but it can also be compulsive exercise. It can be taking laxatives. Some people, I know Lily Allen wrote in her book about taking enough sleeping pills so that she would sleep for 3 days to kind of rid herself of calories. Yeah, there's lots of ways that people do it.
Okay, I just want to say if people are listening and they're feeling triggered by this, you know, it's really important. You can give us a call, talk to us about it. My number is 07 506 319 745. There's a great charity called Beat that you can Google, and they will help you. They've got some great services, and also your GP, if you're struggling with food and you're finding yourself being triggered in this conversation, have a chat with your GP, or just talk to somebody that, you know, cares about you and that you trust, and tell them that you're struggling. Talking to your GP may be more complicated though, so we're going to get onto that conversation about how GPs respond to bulimia in particular, and the misconceptions around it. But just to say, I mean, we're going to continue the conversation, but I want us to be thoughtful about people who may be being triggered by it. If you are, you know, listen to that. if you're feeling uncomfortable in this conversation, and Natasha's describing behaviours that you're finding difficult, that maybe you haven't talked to somebody about, I'd really encourage you to start chatting with people about it. And one of the reasons why on this show I do encourage people to be open about their struggles is for this thing we call identification. And identification is when you hear from somebody else an experience that you've had yourself. And often, if you haven't talked to somebody about it before, it may be the first time that you hear something very similar. If that's what's going on for you, trust that and go and get help, really. So Natasha, thanks for being courageous enough to talk about it. So the interesting about bulimia that most people don't know is that it's not obvious that somebody has an eating disorder. Okay, whereas something like anorexia, restriction, it's obvious that somebody, well, to the non-anorexic, the non-disordered person, we look at an anorexic and go, there's something wrong, there's something going on. A bulimic can be of perfectly healthy BMI, but their relationship to food and their relationship to their own body is very, very distorted and very disordered. And then somebody who's an overeater, which is the third category of disordered eating, may well be obese, and it may be obvious that they have obesity, but bulimia in particular can often be really, really difficult to sort of know unless you know the other behaviours, which the bulimic, the person who has the disorder, will often work at hiding and hide very successfully. Does that, you're nodding away there going, yeah, that's what happened to me.
Yes, although I have to just challenge a little bit the kind of definition of anorexia, because I have a very good friend of mine, Hope Virgo, has a campaign called Dump the Scales, because her argument is, and she is somebody who with experience of anorexia herself, that eating disorders are a mental illness and they should be measured in units of psychological distress, not using BMI.
100%.
And somebody can be restricting their food, and there's lots of reasons why somebody's weight doesn't directly correlate to their calorie intake. You know, there's medical reasons, hormonal reasons, and somebody can from the outside look healthy, whatever that means, but be in a lot of psychological distress. And that's true of anorexia, but it is, as you say, particularly true of bulimia, because your body gets very adept at hanging on to any kind of calories that it can. And so therefore most people with bulimia are either a normal BMI or they're actually slightly overweight. So it's inaccurate. You know, I hear a lot of people say anorexia and bulimia are in the same breath as though they're the same, and they're very, very different in their nature.
It's also, I mean, and again, this is, you know, just picking up on that point about how we do or don't diagnose all of these eating disorders. That BMI is a very small part of the diagnosis, I can tell you. And BMI is there, for people that don't know, body mass index is a calculation between your weight and your height, and one is divided by the other, and you come up with this number. And there's a range of numbers that are relevant, that are either healthy or unhealthy, depending on your gender and your age and things like that. But BMI itself is a blunt tool, and really as a clinician I only use it in cases where somebody's significantly under because it's medically dangerous, or significantly over because, again, there's medical. And when we go and see a GP, that's often the only thing they'll do is the BMI. And then make a clinical assessment based upon one measurement, which I, as an eating disorder specialist, is the smallest bit of the assessment, because most of the assessment is what you've just described, due to these psychological processes. So it's the relationship the individual has to themselves, their own body, and to food that defines, and certain types of behaviors clinically as well. You know, for the diagnostic manuals, you have to be bulimic, you have to have done certain purging activities twice, if you want to know, to pass the test. But it is this relationship that the individual has to themselves and their food. And I guess the point I was making was more about that, really, about you had this really uncomfortable, difficult relationship to yourself, your body, your sense of self, and part of how you tried to manage that was through the way you managed food, which was for you seemed okay, but for other people, did they know? Were you hiding? Did you know there was something weird about what you were doing? Because
I did and I didn't. So eating disorders were very well publicized back then, more so than other mental illnesses, I would say. But they only really ever presented themselves in one particular type of media story. It was always a very emaciated white girl in her underwear, and there was a before and after picture. So that's what I thought an eating disorder was. I thought it was anorexia, and it only happened to a certain type of person. With bulimia, I think, being a woman and because of the environment I was in, the industry that I was in, when I did disclose to friends initially, they just completely normalized it. They were like, well, everyone does that occasionally. And it almost like it was just part of dieting. And therefore that made me feel very embarrassed, like I was making a big fuss about nothing. And that wasn't helped by the fact that the first time I went to a GP was about 3 years into my eating disorder, and he weighed me, told me that I wasn't underweight, and said there was nothing that he could do for me. And I can't tell you how ashamed I felt, because I thought, I've just taken up 6 minutes of a GP's time that could have been used on somebody who had a real problem.
And so that really deflated this, what we call help-seeking behaviour, which is something I talk to people about all the time. That, what protects us in life is the ability to ask for help. And if the people that we ask help for, now, I'm not going to have a go at GPs here. This is a very complex area, and it takes me ages to come up with a diagnosis with somebody. The minimum amount of time I'd spend with somebody talking about this would be an hour for an assessment. 6 minutes is not enough time to figure out what's going on. And I'm not going to put that sort of pressure on GPs. They do the best that they can. There is something, though, about how we need to sort of discuss more about these things and more about mental health issues in general. And also, I think we need to really look at how we do primary care in the UK in terms of GP surgeries and in terms of dealing with mental health issues. And we've begun to go some way towards it. There's a thing called IAPT, which is a great service, increased access to psychological therapies, which again is a primary care service. And if you want to know where yours is, you just Google IAPT plus your local authority, and it'll tell you where your wellbeing team is. And they will help you with mental health diagnoses if you're sort of wondering about it. They may not always be able to help you with treatments, but they can certainly signpost you. I can see here IAPT teams up and down the country going, no, we'll stop people, don't tell people to phone us. But it's actually, they're really good practitioners, and it's a really great service around mental health. And get in touch with it if you're worried about and you want a good diagnosis. That they will help a lot and sort of signpost you. But we still have a long way to go, I think, in terms of how, and I think more about the tools and resources we give to GP surgeries. And over 80% of our health contact is in a GP surgery. So that's where we have to be. We can't invent new hospitals for these things. It's a waste of time. People go to see their GP, that's where they go, and that's where we need to put these resources, all of them, in terms of mental health. You mentioned several times that eating disorders are a mental illness. Can you say from your perspective what you mean by that? I happen to agree with you, but why you're clear about saying that rather than something else?
I think it's because when people are talking about eating disorders, they tend to focus on the physical symptoms, and they're just a side effect of what's going on in your head. And if you address what's going on in someone's head, then the behavior, comes along with it. But I think it's particularly important for me to emphasize that, because originally the therapy that I had focused solely on me no longer engaging in bulimic behaviors. And whilst that was useful, it didn't take away what was going on in my head.
And it's the truth as well, in terms of prior to the pandemic, there was a 46% increase in children being referred to hospital with eating disorders. And I mean, I was just talking to a psychiatrist about this the other day, who I was recruiting to do some work for me, who works in a CAMS, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, in the eating disorders service. And during the pandemic, we've seen the use of hospital admissions increase. And the only capacity they have in those services at the moment is to manage food. That's all they can offer those kids. So it's a meal plan and an enforcement of the meal plan. And that's what treatment looks like at the moment. And that's really unfortunate, because of course it's not treatment. Although it's really helpful to teach somebody what a healthy meal looks like and how to eat healthily. If you become very disordered in your relationship to that and don't understand that, it's a useful tool. It's a useful thing to have. Here's your meal plan, and follow it and all that sort of stuff, and it can help. But as you say, it doesn't deal with the reason you got to the point of need. Why did you get to the point where you needed a meal plan? Because something else was going on. And it's that something else that needed to be dealt with. And so what happened? What was your story in terms of getting that something else dealt with? How long did it take you? I mean, you went to see this GP, did the best they could, but left you floored. You were in an industry that normalized this very unhealthy behavior. How did you get to the point where you are now, where clearly you've recovered in the eating disorder?
Well, it's interesting that so my mum remarried about 12 years ago now, but she met her current husband a couple of years before that. And he had no knowledge or experience of eating disorders whatsoever. And I immediately, really liked him, really connected with him, knew that he was a sort of good guy that I could trust. And I confided in him because I think after so many people making me feel like I was making a fuss over nothing, I wanted somebody to be shocked. And he was, although he didn't show that in the classic way of being shocked. He just went, he said, okay, he said, I don't know anything about this, but I'm going to learn more about it and we will get this sorted. And that was exactly what I needed to hear at that time.
Right.
So he helped me to, he took me to a specialist eating disorder service who did the assessment that you spoke about, the much longer assessment. I received a diagnosis of severe bulimia nervosa. That was the first step. And then I was put on a waiting list for therapy. And fortunately, my parents were in a position where they said, we don't want you to have to wait. So they paid for me to have some private sessions.
Right.
Initially, I had NLP, which the
So
guy...
I don't know, it's neuro-linguistic programming.
Yes, right. And the guy that was the practitioner of the NLP, he was a little bit evangelical now, I look back on it, and he told me that he could cure me in 3 sessions and that he didn't need to know anything about my history. And I believed him. And because I believed him, for a little while after those 3 sessions, I was better because I'd kind of bought into that. But it wasn't long before I relapsed. And that's when I had cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, that you talked about earlier. And that was much, much more effective.
I just want to interject here, if you don't mind, because I'm really concerned about these magical healers that exist out there. I find it highly disturbing that we're talking about disorders that kill people, and you don't just have a magical quick fix. People don't believe anybody who tells you that about an eating disorder, any sort of mental illness, any serious mental illness, particularly eating disorders. Eating disorders have one of the highest mortality rates of mental illnesses. And you really need to go and see people. And so my advice is, if somebody's telling you that they're going to cure you in a few sessions, that's just not true. And you're likely to have a relapse, and relapses are really dangerous. That's when people die, during the relapse. So I'm glad that didn't happen to you, the dying bit. That would have been unfortunate, really. And thanks for sharing that that sort of experience as well, because I think that, we do often, as people go into, we're very vulnerable and desperate often when we're asking for help in those situations. And it can be really sort of easy to listen to somebody who can say, well, I can sort it out for you like that. Which it's not going to happen. It's not realistic, but you have recovered, and recovery is possible, and a good life is possible. And we'll talk about what recovery means and all that sort of stuff. But this is what worked for you. You went to see this guy, gave you some confidence. It didn't really work. You then went to see somebody using an evidence-based approach, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, and that did work for you.
Well, that allowed me to stop the behaviors, like I said. So that was when I learned about something called mindful eating, which is all about being present when you eat and noticing how stuff tastes. I learned to present my food always really beautifully. So it's a bit of a running joke now, actually. At our wedding, my husband said, I won't allow people to eat snacks out of the packet in my house. It has to be decanted into a bowl. And he said in his wedding speech, she's now got me trained to the extent that I always decant my Monster Munch into a ramekin. But it's, I always, if I buy a sandwich, I always have to put it on a plate and things like that. And also to leave a little bit on my plate as well, as a kind of, and these are things that were so hard to do at first, but now I just do them instinctually. They're just part of the way that I approach food. And that I also had to identify what my trigger foods were. So those were the foods that I would buy if I was intending to binge. And for a little while, I had to cut them out of my diet, although I did reintroduce them. So it wasn't forever, but I did have to avoid them for a little while.
That's sensible. We say that to people, for example, who have to give up alcohol. Initially, it's probably a good idea to get rid of all the corkscrews and things like that. You can have them back a few years later, but initially don't have them around because it might be a bit too tempting, that's all. But no, that's great. So, I mean, you've really moved on from it then. But yes. I remember we had a conversation, didn't we, about this, and it was sort of, although you've managed the behaviours now and you're recovered in the eating disorder, that anxiety stuff is still around, isn't it? And it's sort of morphed into other areas of your life.
Yes. So I was delighted to be free from bulimia, but there were still other things that didn't feel quite right to me. I still had a lot of anxiety. So eventually I went to see a counsellor, and I went to see a counsellor for 2 years weekly to talk about where my anxiety had come from and what had caused it, and just to address the psychological elements of my illness. And also it's taken me a really long while to be at peace with my body. And I've actually done that through when I first recovered from bulimia, I gained a lot of weight, and I had to be okay with that, to the extent that I was entering myself into plus size modeling competitions and being parts of campaign groups and stuff, because I was like, I have to love and accept this, because this is what my body looks like when I'm treating it well. But actually that was just a very short-term thing, and eventually my weight kind of leveled out to what it probably should have always been. But it was, it would have been so easy to panic and go, I'm overweight now, I need to go on a diet. But that would have sent me straight spiraling back into those really toxic behaviors. So I've found now, for example, as part of that kind of healthy lifestyle, that exercise has been really instrumental in my recovery. It connects me with my body, and it allows me to listen to my body and what it wants, and to be kind and respectful of it.
Great. And you got that through going to this counselling for a couple of years. You sort of got some more breakthroughs into what was going on for you, insight, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I said that it began when I was 10, and I actually wrote about this in my book, that it never occurred to me that there were two things that happened when I was 10. And as soon as I said it to my counsellor, it made total sense. But at the time, it just didn't occur to me. So my brother was born 4 months premature. So he was born at 25 weeks, 10 months after my other brother. So I'd been an only child for 8 years. And then suddenly I've got two siblings, one of whom was really poorly. And then the second thing that happened was my cousin, who was a year younger than me, died of cancer in the same hospital where my brother was born.
Yeah.
And that's a lot for a 10-year-old. And that's when my panic attack started.
Too much for a 10-year-old. That's far
right.
too much to have to deal with. You poor thing.
But I say that to you now and you go, of course that makes sense. But at the time, it just seemed like they came out of the blue.
That's what we do, though, isn't it? We have these, particularly when we're young, we can have these very difficult experiences, and we just normalize them. We just get on. We don't really look at them because, of course, we can't. We experience them, and they become part of who we are, and we need some way of looking at them, getting an observer perspective upon them to understand the impact upon us. I mean, it seems to me that those were quite traumatic events, if you don't mind me using those words. I mean, sort of having new siblings may not sound traumatic, but it can be, and particularly in those circumstances, that it's a shocking change to your life, and then losing somebody as well at the same time. And also, I think one of the things we do know psychologically that, if you have 2 or 3 events in a row, the impact of them is multiplied.
Right.
And it's one of the things that we're going through with the pandemic at the moment, and with the fact that there are new outbreaks, and we're not out of the first wave, and it's going up and down. And it's that type of, when things stack upon each other, they have a multiplying effect. And it's one of the things that we're going through as a society at the moment. And certainly, you would have gone through, you poor thing, as a 10-year-old. Is those are 3 very distinct events, which any one of them, maybe you as an individual, but within your family, any one of them you may have processed, and they may not have left a long-term impact. But 3 of them going on, that that's the multiplier going on, and that's quite traumatic. And I say traumatic because I want to link it to an earlier part of our conversation, that and the idea that we're born with mental illness is it's such a limited view of what it is, because trauma, of course, you don't know this, but just a bit of information for people. Trauma is one of those things that can change us genetically. And there's a reason for that, which I won't bore people with, but it changes our DNA, and it becomes encoded and can be transmitted in that way. And those types of traumatic events do produce mental illness. And those types of events, there's a thing called ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences. You can get an ACE score, and those with higher ACE scores are more likely to develop mental illness or psychological distress later on in life. We have more and more evidence of this stuff all the time, that it's life that makes us ill. And that's what we have to deal with, is that, and developing what we call resilience, and resilient strategies, so that we help people get buffered against those impacts, but also developing other strategies, transformations, which is part of what you've been talking about. You developed strategies because you were damaged and you had to be fixed in the broadest sense, but not just that. You did something else, which is you transformed the pain into something else. It wasn't just a case of I got treatment and I got fixed and I'm all right now, thank you very much. You've done something else as well, which is interesting. Which is why you got the MBE, and whatever it's going to be called after tomorrow, you'll still have it. But what do you think, why do you think that was, rather than just go, oh, great, I'm out of the bulimia, that's good. For most people, that would be good enough,
Yeah.
I don't have to purge anymore. Great, I'll get on with my life. But you didn't. You went further, and I'm intrigued by that. I'm intrigued. I mean, tell us some of the things that you're doing currently, and then we'll maybe loop back in the conversation, because I've got some of the things open, and I'll just tell people about them. So you've got a podcast on Spotify called Staying Sane. You've got a project called Where's Your Head At, and you can tell us a bit about that. Your website, NatashaDevon.com, has a lot of educational resources on it, because you do a lot of work in schools. You've got a couple of books out, a beginner's guide to being mental. I like that title. And Yes You Can. So you've got an extraordinary range of things. Tell us about them, and then I'm going to loop back and we're going to figure out why you became that you grew from these experiences rather than, just burrowed down into them. So tell us about these various projects that you're doing.
Okay, well, my main job, well, certainly before lockdown, my main job was going into schools and researching and delivering talks to young people.
Yeah.
And there's two reasons why I do things in the way that I do. First of all, I felt that my life would have been better if somebody had taught me that everyone has mental health, and in just the same way as everyone has physical health.
Yeah.
And it's something that you can nurture and understand in just the same way. And you don't have to wait until these extreme symptoms manifest before you think about it and before you address it.
If you're listening, please don't wait. Do your mental health, mental wealth training now, well before you get ill. It's a bit like waiting till you have a heart attack and then learning to do exercise. It's bonkers to do it that way.
Yeah.
We just wouldn't do that. It's exactly the same with mental illness. You can avoid a lot. Sorry, Natasha.
So I thought, how do I universalize the mental health conversation? And I realized that I needed to understand those day-to-day mental health challenges that young people are going through. So I started researching, doing focus groups with teenagers and finding out what was missing from their pastoral program at school, their personal health and social education. And the things that came up were things like body image, social media, bullying, exam stress, self-harm. These aren't necessarily the first things you think of when you hear the term mental health, but these are the things that they were experiencing. And I thought, if I can talk to them at that level, you kickstart the conversation, and then it kind of puts them on the right path where they can evolve their understanding. But I was also very aware that I don't have a PhD. I'm not a doctor. And I wanted to make sure that it was all based in really solid evidence. So I found a group of experts in neuroscience, psychology, psychiatry, and it's still this symbiotic relationship that I have with them, where they tell me what the science is, and then I translate that science into something that's hopefully relevant for teenagers.
Brilliant. Fantastic.
So that's
wonderful. That's absolutely wonderful. My experience of working with young people is that they eat this stuff up. If you, particularly the science, if you can turn science into something, they're really fascinated by this stuff. Start talking neuroscience to young people, and they're like, "Wow, is that how my brain works? Oh man, that's amazing! It's fantastic." Actually, I can imagine those talks are really, really good fun. Actually,
I hope brilliant. So.
Well, I imagine they are. Imagine the young people get really, really intensely interested and involved. I love the fact that what you did was you did these focus groups to find out what was missing. So it wasn't just you and your ego going in and saying, "Oh, I do this." You actually did your research and you found out what young people need. And fantastic, great piece of work. And how long have you been doing that for now?
Since 2008, so 12 years.
Wow.
When I first started doing this, young people used to say, "Oh, I wish you were my sister," because when I first started going into schools, I was 27. So I was that.
You're not going to tell me you're old. Forget it. You're not old.
No, but I am now. So I'm going to be 40 next year.
Right.
So I do now. I get that. "Oh, you remind me of my auntie." Okay. Or my mum saw you on this morning and she loves you. These are the kinds of things that I get from young people now. But it's cool. It's fine. Everyone needs an auntie, don't they? A caring auntie.
Yeah. You'd still be my sister. You're still young enough to be my sister, so don't you worry. You're still somebody's sister, Natasha. It's all right.
That is true. Okay.
That's amazing. I love it. That's a really good sign. What are the other main things that you're doing at the moment?
So my two main campaigning projects at the moment are Where's Your Head At? And that is a campaign to change workplaces' attitude to mental health.
Right.
And the idea for that came about because when I first started doing these talks, as I say, it was a long time ago, and talks on mental health in schools were not as widespread as they are now. And young people used to ask me, "I've got this friend and I'm worried about them. What should I say? What should I do?" And sometimes the friend was them, but it was always a peer-to-peer thing. But what I noticed was over the past 5 years, young people started saying to me, I've got this adult in my life, whether it's their parent or their auntie or their uncle or whoever it is, and I can see that they're struggling with their mental health, because young people are really literate in mental health now, but they won't admit it because there's so much more stigma in those older generations. So I thought, I've got to find a way to get to the adults, and it's much harder because in schools you've got a captive audience. And I thought, where are they? And then I realized they're at work, most of them. So I teamed up with Bauer Media, who they are an umbrella organization, but they've got brands like Grazia, Kiss FM, Absolute, Heat, Closer, Mother and Baby, Empire. They're massive. And together we came up with this idea of, there's lots of different things that we've done, but at the root of it, there's this call for the government to change the law so that in every workplace, employers must make equal provision for physical and mental health first aid. So if you've got a physical health first aider, you need to have a mental health first aider. There needs to be parity between those two things. And that's obviously not going to solve everything, but that's kind of the heart of the campaign, to kind of start that culture change.
Right. And do you go into workplaces and encourage these conversations around sort of mental health and mental illness and understanding? Are you doing something similar to what you're doing with the young people, for example?
Yeah, we have a manifesto of good practice for employers that's been signed up to by lots of big companies, and also lots of MPs have signed up to it as well. And I tend to do talks about and this is what one of my books is about the impact of stress on your ability to be productive, because I think in so many workplaces there's still this attitude of almost stress is a badge of honor and overworking is a badge of honor, and people don't understand that it's impacting their ability to be productive and problem solve and think creatively. And all of that.
Stress is one of the biggest killers on the planet. Literally. I mean, it will physically kill you, as well as and it'll really mess you up on the way to being dead. Psychologically, it's a really, really sort of nasty thing, stress and burnout, without a doubt. And one thing I think that is going on at the moment, and one thing that because one of my companies specializes in working in the workplace, but trying to promote best practice in terms of dealing with mental illness in situ. Because one thing that still happens in most workplaces, if somebody becomes mentally ill, the idea is that they get treatment elsewhere. The figures are that because of that model of practice, over 90% of people who develop mental illness in the workplace never come back. So they're gone. That's it. They're gone from the workforce forever, which, given the current situation we're in, is not a sustainable model, because we won't have an economy. We have to change it, and we have to change it now, and we have to bring in. So we did this. Again, I don't want to bore people with this stuff, but 30 years ago, we brought in legislation to shut down psychiatric wards because we knew that the hospitals were the worst place for people to be. So we started treating people in their homes and their communities, and that's far more successful in terms of mental health than anything else. But workplaces still have this really medieval, out-of-date approach that mental illness is something that's separate and has to be, particularly if it's real mental illness, like, bipolar or trauma or an eating disorder, go over there and get treatment and then maybe come back to us. That's a good way to get rid of your workforce. And particularly right now, we're going to be having people returning to work. And we know this for a fact. The Royal College of Psychiatrists did a study about a month ago, and has demonstrated that the pool of people with mental illness has grown during the period of lockdown. Just the actual physical number of people with mental illness has grown, and the actual severity of those illnesses have increased. So what we've got are people returning to the workforce, that a greater number have mental illness, and the severity of those mental illnesses have grown. In fact, the people who already had diagnosis of mental illness, we've done really well during this period, because we've been really careful with ourselves, because we've all gone,
that's true.
This is dangerous. I need to really be thoughtful about myself. I have to be very careful, make sure I eat, make sure I sleep properly, etc., etc. And so we've got all the tools and resources. It's everybody else who hasn't. have been much more at risk. So that sort of thing has shifted. And so
that's so true.
It really is.
So true.
It's on every level, every single, like in terms of drinking, for example, those that were thoughtful about their drinking before lockdown have just stopped it and have not gone back to it. Those that were borderline problems or definitely have a problem. Those that were in problem are very serious in their problem. So everything has shifted like that. But it's one of the things I'm going on about at the moment is that we're going to have to have a really radical new approach in the workplace towards treatment of mental illness. Not even just talking about it, because with figures where over 90% of people who develop a mental illness don't return to work, that's not sustainable. If we move to a situation in which 70 or 80% of the people in the population have a diagnosable mental illness, which is what we're looking at, by the end of the 3 years of this pandemic, which is how long it's going to take, we're going to have to do something very different. So that's my soapbox. I'll get off it now.
It was a good soapbox. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Not many people tell me they enjoy my soapboxes. You just get up and go away. But you can come back.
Thanks.
I'm interested why you didn't just, after sort of getting the help that you needed, why you did just quietly then get on with your life in terms of, right, okay, I'm over my eating disorder. This is great. I can eat in a healthy way. I can eat in a mindful way. I can enjoy my food, etc. And why that wasn't enough. Somehow you wanted to go further. What was it about you, do you think, that meant that you wanted to move on to being an advocate and changing things and improving things for other people?
I think it was two things. First of all, I have always had what my mum calls an overdeveloped sense of fairness. Okay. Just want everything to be fair. And I felt that there was transferable wisdom. There were things that I could extrapolate from my own experiences, things that were wrong with the world that needed to be fixed.
Right. So
that was the kind of more noble reason. I think the other reason, which is slightly less noble, is that I had an eating disorder for 8 years. I spent that 8 years, with my head in a toilet, essentially. And I couldn't bear the thought that I'd lost nearly a decade.
Right.
I had to make it mean something. I had to do something with it.
Okay. Now that's the interesting word, and that's the word I was looking for, meaning. And trying to make meaning from, and I think it's really, really important at times like this. So it's a term that's often used in what's called positive psychology. And it also, some people use spiritual. It's also encapsulated in religious terminology. I'm not suggesting these are words that you would use, but from psychological perspectives, creating meaning from difficult or traumatic experiences fits into that broad range of human experience, and it's how we transform from trauma to growth. And I think it's really important at times like this as well, because we're in a situation where the resilience models, which is mostly what mental health treatment is, mental health treatment mostly, like CBT, for example, is just about it's about managing symptoms so you're not as distressed by them, as you know, but it's also about giving you new tools so you're more resilient in the future. So you have healthier habits and healthier ways of thinking, healthy ways of behaving, so that you improve your resilience, so that if something comes along that's upsetting, you're better able to manage it, so that it doesn't hurt you. But it's all part of that sort of resilience approach, develop strength through whatever ways. But this transformation stuff, this positive stuff is very different. And I think that, at times like this time, my belief is that resilience models are not going to be enough. We don't have enough therapists to treat the number of people who are going to need treatment, and all that sort of stuff. And also, the pandemic is just too big, and so it does overwhelm our capacity to cope, and so we have to have new ways of thinking better. And this meaning stuff, is really, really important. I was wondering about that with you, whether that had happened to you, that there was this sense of almost like a higher purpose.
Yeah.
You know.
Yes, I do. I mean, initially, when I first started working with young people, my plan was to develop a new way of delivering personal health and social education and kind of give it to teachers and then do something else.
Yeah.
And the more time I spent in schools, the more I realized how deep these issues go, and you always end up in this really philosophical, existential place. You start talking about what's the point of education, and then ultimately what's the meaning of life, why are we here?
Yeah.
And my work has really evolved since I started, but it does feel like a calling more than a job.
Yeah. And is that something that was in your family culture, do you think?
I think the thing that so me and my brothers are very different.
Right.
I really like my brothers. I would choose them as friends. They're great people, but they're very different from me. They lead very different lives from me. But I would say the one thing that we all have in common is that we're not motivated by the things that other people seem to be motivated by. So none of us are really that bothered by money, for example, or having the right clothes or the right car. And so when people are talking about those kind of very external things, we're sort of, because it doesn't make sense to us as a motivating factor. That I think is a very hollow way to live your life.
And were you close growing up as a family? Were you sort of supportive?
Yeah, I mean, this is what I was going to say about the resilience thing. Is I think people misuse the word. They think it means just soldiering on and getting on with it. But
no, it doesn't mean that at all.
It doesn't mean that at all. And where I'm the oldest out of my siblings. I'm the oldest out of all my cousins. Very physically healthy as a child. Very robust. Very active. Sorry,
Natasha, there's a problem with the sound. Just bear with me 1 second.
Sorry, we appear to be experiencing some technical difficulties. I've just spoken to Noel. His computer has decided that it wants to crash.
Oh no.
Yeah, what a horrible time, right? For it to decide that it doesn't want to work anymore. But he's just restarting now, so he'll be with us shortly. Which
does that mean I have to riff?
Got any good jokes? Any good stand up?
Yeah. What do you call a fish with 4 eyes?
I don't know. What do you call a fish with 4 eyes?
Fish.
Not bad. Not bad. It's better than anything I could think of. What's that? I used to know a good one. What do you call a man standing between two houses?
I don't know.
You call him Ali.
Oh, good. I like it. It's also, that's gender neutral. You could use it for a woman as well.
You could do as well. Yeah. I mean, I was just trying to improvise off the top of my head. So
I heard a really good joke the other day. I've got a Russian friend who is a sound engineer and a Czech one too.
Hello, I'm back. There you go. That proves the show's live at the very least. So there you go. Thanks, BT. for that. I just got to the point in the conversation where you were just beginning to talk about resilience and not being sort of armored against the world, but being something else. What is resilience to you?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a soapbox of mine, if I'm honest, because being and again, this is something I talk about in A Beginner's Guide to Being Mental, that I felt not entitled to feel the things that I was feeling about Joe being born and Chloe dying. So it was very much, I was 8 years older than my eldest brother. So I was very involved in the childcare with him and helping my mum and being a good girl and being useful. And I had to be the strong one. And I sort of started to swallow down all the sadness and the anger that I felt at that time. And I was angry because it wasn't fair, which is where my fairness thing comes from. I swallowed it down. And I think that that's what created the panic, because it kind of, all that unarticulated emotion had to come out somehow. Yeah. And it would have been, you probably would have looked at me as a child, going to school, getting straight A's, coming home, looking after my little brother, as an incredibly resilient child. But actually the more resilient thing to do would have been to have addressed those feelings and let myself experience them. And so I feel that it's a misused term, particularly by people who like to talk about the snowflake generation, it's tied up in that rhetoric.
Absolutely. I'll give you my definition, if you like, professionally, of resilience. Resilience is the number and quality of your social connections. The greater, the deeper, the more diverse your social connections are, the more resilient you are. And that's it. It's nothing to do with personal strength. It's everything to do with how well connected you are to other people, how much you can tell other people about your vulnerabilities and fears, and so that you can offload them, essentially, sort of give them to other people. Then you're likely to be resilient. And resilience is more like, the Chinese notion of be the piece of grass rather than the tree.
Yes. Yeah.
So you can bend with things. You have flexibility. You have the capacity to absorb. But we only have the capacity to absorb when we're really genuinely socially connected. And this is why certain, I'm talking about intersectional issues here. This is why certain people are more prone to mental illness than others, because of the impacts of social isolation, because society makes certain definitions of people, applies it to them and treats them in a particular way that makes them feel less connected. So if you're a young black guy in Hackney, I live in Hackney, you will have a certain set of experiences that me, as a white, middle-aged bloke, won't have, and I'm automatically going to feel more connected because the world sends me signals saying I'm connected. I'm valued in certain ways, whereas that 15-year-old kid that lives around the street from me, who is black, and will be getting messages saying you're less connected, and therefore is more prone, less resilient.
It's interesting that you say that, actually, because I found this fantastic campaign on Instagram recently called Pink Ladoo. I don't know if you know about ladoos, but it's in Hindu culture, if you have a baby and it's a boy, you send these ladoos, which are like little boiled sweets, in packets to everyone that you know, to say, hey, we've had a boy, and to celebrate. And if you have a girl, nothing happens. So this campaign have teamed up with Asian sweet shops all over the UK to create these pink ladoos, these packets of pink ladoos that women can send out to their family or families can send out to their friends and family if they have a girl. And it's a really like rock and roll thing to do in that culture. But one of the things that's come out of that community being created is a lot of Asian women saying that because they live in a culture where there's an expectation that they'll spend a lot of time in the home, people talking about lockdown and the impact that it's having on them has been really triggering for them.
Yeah. In what ways? What ways has it been triggering?
Because it's that thing you were saying earlier about how when someone else articulates something, you suddenly realize that's what you're going through. So people talking about being stuck at home and not being able to go out and socialize, and their freedom being impinged upon, and then realizing that that's the way that they're feeling too.
Yeah, absolutely. The normalization shifts, the frame shifts. I had that as well, because I grew up in quite a violent family, and I remember the first time I went to a friend's home, and I broke something. I'm thinking about it because I broke something earlier on today, and breaking things can still be a bit of a trigger for me, because if I broke something at home, I'd get beaten. That's what would happen. And I remember I broke something at a friend's house, and they didn't beat me. I thought, you're weird. Sort of, why don't you beat me for that? That was very strange. But it was the first time that had been challenged in me, that this normalization, this is normally what happens. So yeah, I get that. I mean, that's really powerful, actually, as an image. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, it isn't something that would have come into my consciousness at all. I mean, one thing I've been saying about the lockdown, people were talking about the lockdown as producing a lot of loneliness. It's the opposite is true. The lockdown has produced a lot of hothousing of relationships, because none of us planned to have relationships this intensely, and none of us planned. And I'm talking about people who've got families and in couples, etc., etc. There was no life plan to be at home for 3 months and not be able to do anything else. And so people have had to develop a whole brand new set of skills around that. So loneliness has not been the issue that people have been. But that's fascinating from sort of Asian female culture, that their sort of isolation, cultural isolation, has been highlighted by this experience of people talking about isolation, because of course their isolation is literally, I've been at home with no contact outside of the home, which is really, that's fascinating. The other thing that we've seen, of course, and some unfortunate things, is the sharp rise in domestic violence. We haven't talked about these things. There's a lot of things, because we're coming to, basically we're at the end of the show, and I did warn you, didn't I, that 90 minutes is not a long time.
No, it's really not.
And it's literally over. The show's over, literally. But there's so many things actually that's bringing up that we could have explored and looked at in terms of, I mean, I genuinely think, and I don't mean this in some twee way at all, the fact of 50,000 people dying in 12 weeks is an unprecedented trauma in the UK's life, without a doubt. That's an unprecedented trauma, and the numbers are going to keep growing. But that's like blitz level death, isn't it? That's what happens in wars. That's what and it's incomprehensible, and we have no idea what that's going to do to us long term. It's with us. Nevertheless, this period of time has produced huge changes, and one of the things that it's going to really change a lot, I think, are sort of how we understand mental health and mental illness, psychological distress, how we understand how we manage it. It's going to have a massive impact on gender issues, in terms of workplace gender issues, and the way we look at work. And I think only for the better, to be honest. And a lot of guys I'm talking about I get quite emotional about this, but I just like, I don't want to go back to work. I've got to know my kids. I've got to know my partner. I've been at home. Fuck that. I'm not going back. They want things to change. So I think there's going to be some really important shifts, and I think there's a possibility maybe that a new intersection called mental illness emerges, because of course, although it has these class, gender, race issues in it, it also is a leveler across, in a bit like addiction can be, where it can actually bring together different cultural, different race experiences, etc. And maybe from that there'll be some sort of common voice that emerges around that. Let's hope. Positive. Natasha, it's been amazing to have you on. We're literally out of time, and we have to finish. I mean, I'd love to sort of think about maybe come back another time and begin to pick up some of these other issues. I'm always fascinated by people who transform experience, and why that happens. And we were just beginning that conversation with you. I think there's a lot more we could explore and discuss with you. And I think those conversations of transformation are particularly needed at this time for the reasons I've outlined, that we can't have a traditional mental illness, mental health response. It's just not going to be possible. We've got to come up with something more interesting, more creative within that. And so hearing stories from people like yourself and the journeys that you are making still are going to be vital, I think, within that. As usual, I've forgotten who's on next week. So I can't say who it is, and yet again, my team are just going to give me a kicking after this for it. So I apologise for that, unless you can remember, James. But I will see you all next week. Been lovely to have you on the show this evening, Natasha. Thanks for all the work that you do out there and on behalf of a grateful nation. And I look forward to finding out what this new thing is going to be tomorrow.
The Times tomorrow.
It's a great initiative, and I think it's absolutely the right time to be doing it. And this is how real change takes place, not sort of smash something down, but here's an improvement. And it's going to be an improvement without a doubt. So I'm looking forward to that. And thanks for giving us a heads up on it. See you all next week. Goodbye for now.